everybody, welcome back to the channel. Okay, so today's my final thoughts video on the rack isolation. I put some Stack Audio Auva 100s underneath my Solid-Tech rack here, and I filled all of the legs up in that rack with this volcanic medium that was of different sizes that I wanted to put in the rack as well. So I went through that process. Obviously we saw the video describing how all of that took place. It was a pretty time-consuming job, to be honest. It took me a lot longer than what I thought it would, and by the time I spiked the Auva 100s and got the rack back into its perfect position and went through that process, there was a good afternoon spent. So let's talk a little bit first of all about how I tested this and what processes I went through. So what I did was I took a reference by simply removing all of the Stack Audio Auva EQs out from underneath each component. I listened to the system with no isolation on the rack. I used that as a basis. I took notes and wrote my experiences, what I was hearing in the soundstage, in the presentation of the system. So then from that point, I took all of the components off the rack. Now I only filmed some of this when I was doing you didn't see the whole process. It just simply would have been too long, and I didn't want to bore you with every stage that I went through. But there's been a lot of testing and listening and note writing that's gone on over the last few weeks as I've been learning about what this rack has been doing and how things have changed in these different versions that I've been going through with the testing. So the next step was to put the medium in the legs and fit the Auva 100s to the feet. Now, I ummed about whether I should do just the medium in the legs first and then do the Auva 100s, but I sort of figured that if you're going to do this kind of thing, if you're going to do a dampening, decoupling, isolation modification on your rack, you're probably going to fill the legs up and do something in relation to decoupling all at the same time. And again, it would have been a long process to go through that step by step. So I put everything back on the rack, all of the components, without the Auva EQs underneath them again. So the first comparison was unmodified rack versus modified rack, still no independent isolation of the components. And I heard a marked improvement in relation to, let me just walk it back a little bit. So when listening to the rack, and this is the first comparison I can do, when listening to the rack and the components on the rack without the independent isolation, it's amazing because you know you get used to something after a while, and you must write notes and you must notice the changes immediately as you notice them. I'm lucky that I have a really good recall memory, but I do also understand that there will be, especially when we're talking about small nuance type changes, that the passage of time between being able to do these things and physically get them done and get everything back on the system will somewhat cloud this review in relation to what I can remember to tell you so I'm talking about things that really stood out to me, because really at the end of the day that's what you guys will want to hear. What were the main standouts? I noticed a really nice change in the sense of a sense of a veil being lifted from the presentation, an easy sort of feeling across the presentation, a more relaxed but focused presentation. And I got that purely and simply from putting the Auva 100s and the medium in the rack. I got that almost that same improvement as I did when I just independently isolated the components, and I went, oh wow, okay, so there was that again, that really that compared to nothing happening and then the modifying of the rack, there was a substantial improvement that was very noticeable in that unveiled presentation, in that in non-fatiguing detail, especially on the, well, both on the digital and on the analog side. Footfall as far as the turntable's concerned. I'm on a suspended timber floor, which obviously isn't ideal, but with no modifications on the rack and just the Kuzma feet on the turntable, when I walk across in front of my rack, I could hear a disturbance in the presentation when listening to a record. So then I did the modifications to the rack, and at that point, my walking across the front of the rack with a record playing, with the modifications under the rack, I could hardly hear. There was hardly anything. There may have been a very, very slight disturbance, but it was almost non-existent. So that was a really, really good improvement. And on the digital side, just a sense of ease, a sense of clarity, a sense of detail without fatigue. So then from going through that process, I then isolated all of the components again with the Stack Audio Auva EQs. And I sat back down again, and that was obviously didn't take as long to do that as it did to modify the rack and go through that process. And there was a further improvement again. So independently isolating components, especially some of the components on my rack that have their own incorporated power supplies resonate. They create a resonant frequency when power goes through a transformer. And that resonant frequency can be transferred, and often is transferred, through the chassis of the component and into the shelf and through the legs, and contaminating all the components on the rack. Now, even on the best racks that are out there, there is this phenomenon happens. This is something where I really believe that independent isolation on any rack is an improvement, and I've heard it time and time again, over just putting components on a really high-end rack and going, well, everything will be right. It can't get any better than that. Every time I've done independent decoupling or isolation of components on a rack where there are more than one component, I hear a further improvement, and there's no exception here. Once I put the EQs underneath all of the components again, there was and I remember thinking to myself at the time, I can't imagine this getting any better, and I must stop saying that, because every time I do something, I tend to get a further, well, not every time, but most things that I do, that I take the time and I think this is a worthy avenue to go down, I find there's a bigger improvement in the system. So note to self, stop saying that's where it can finish, because I've continued with the isolation of all the components in this room, and the speakers, the subwoofer and everything, continually hear a further veil being lifted away from the soundstage and the presentation. And that was the case here. There was just more focus again, more focus on the digital side. Let's talk about that first. More focus on image presentation. So pinpointing of an image in a soundstage was more in focus again. I liken it to, fiddling around with some binoculars, and you think you're really sharp, and then you just move that focus, that fraction more, and it suddenly it really snaps into focus. Well, that's the best way to describe what I was hearing here when I isolated the components separately. There was just that further sharpness in the image definition. There was more defined air around the musicians in the soundstage. There was more nuance. There was more atmosphere. All of these micro detail things that are portrayed in the system but can easily be lost through contamination and vibration and poor quality power. All of these small things These little things, we must dot those I's and cross those T's if we're looking for that ultimate focus and performance out of our system. And that was the case here with this. When I independently isolated the components, there was a further step up. And those were the sorts of things on the digital side that I noticed. It got easier, a further sense of easiness to listen to the system. On the analog side, playing the turntable, I could literally heavily walk across the front of my rack with no audible disturbance in the presentation, none whatsoever. So the putting of the EQs underneath the turntable further added, and that proved to me that there is some contamination still across the shelves of the rack and with components. And when everything was independently isolated, there was a further cleaning up, and on the analog side, just a less disturbance and vibration coming from external influences. So that was really love. It's the best I've ever heard my turntable sound, as far as the micro detail being fleshed out in the recording and nothing disturbing the analog playback when someone walks across the front of the room and past the turntable. Look, it was never bad, but it was, by any stretch, I would have done something about it long ago. But it's funny when you get used to something and you think that's as good as you'll get it. You do something like this and you further improve your componentry. So this has been a real revelation for me. It was absolutely worth every second I spent doing it. I really have noticed that I have this wonderful ease across my system now, and this wonderful detachment of anything external from influencing the presentation. It just is a dream to come in here and listen to things now. It's just a further tweaking up of the scale, if you like, and it's been great. And I can certainly, absolutely, 100% recommend whatever isolation product you use. There are obviously different ones in the marketplace. I've tried most of them, but I very much am 100% behind the Stack Audio products. Their particle dampening technology, spiking of the speaker isolation is just, I think, where the sweet spot is. The missing link, if you like. On a rack, you don't want the rack moving at all, just like you don't want the front baffle on your speaker moving at all. So I spiked the rack because it was going in one spot and it wasn't going to move again. And by doing that, and also with the particle dampening technology, which gives you that absorbing factor of anything coming up through the floor, really hits the ball out of the park for me. It was a real massive improvement. In fact, I wouldn't even say it's a small improvement. When you get into the resolution that I'm lucky enough to have in this room, I must put massive into context here. I really think I've heard somewhere around a 5 or 6, 7% improvement over the presentation by doing the rack isolation on top of the component isolation. I mean, I always had the component isolation in there for some time now, and I noticed quite a good improvement there. But the rack on top of the component isolation has taken it to a new level. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. That is absolutely a win for me. It's a big thumbs up again from Stack Audio for their products. Very happy to have it in my system. So leave your questions in the comments below the video if you've got any further questions. I hope I've covered most of it off. If there's any further questions, please leave them in there, and I will endeavour to get to you and answer them all. I appreciate you watching. I appreciate it if you give the video a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed, I'd ask you to please do that. Growing the channel will give me the opportunity to be able to not be ignored in this industry, for people to want to send me product to review on this channel, and that means you guys then have another avenue in which to get an independent evaluation on something that I'm reviewing in the room. So that is this video. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.